Hello, my name is Leonard, and this is the Symantec Enterprise Vault 10 for Exchange Administration course, lesson number 1, Introduction to Enterprise Vault. In this particular lesson, we're going to do an overview of the Enterprise Vault environment, which we're going to describe the business challenges that are addressed by using Enterprise Vault. We're then going to get in and look at the Enterprise Vault functions to talk about the basic concepts and terminology that we will be using in an Enterprise Vault environment. And then we'll get into the basics of the Enterprise Vault architecture. We'll discuss both physical and logical containers and structures that we're going to be using in our Enterprise Vault environment. So our first lesson is going to be the Enterprise Vault overview. When we get done with this, you should be able to describe the purpose and the benefits of using Enterprise Vault. So when I use the term Enterprise Vault, what am I trying to explain or describe? What I'm looking at is the capability of taking unstructured data and archiving it. This unstructured data can be from a variety of different sources. It can be from Exchange, SharePoint, file system, and some messaging. Basically, these items are all called our target frontline servers, and we'll be looking at that again in much more detail in later lessons, how we set that up and use that. Another advantage of using the Enterprise Vault is not only can we set up this archiving of these individual items, we can also go through and specify that they're going to happen automatically. We can set up scheduled times in order for this archiving to take place to try to minimize the impact on our end users. However, at the same time, you do have the capability of allowing your users to manually archive email if they wish. We'll look at part of the indexing functionality. This is what gives you the capability of being able to search and find items for both your regular usage as well as Enterprise Vault add-ons such as Compliance Accelerator and Discovery Accelerator. We'll also be able to go through and once we found these items, retrieve them, both whether it's for a legal case or just for an end user's needs. Now, another thing that we're going to be able to do with the Enterprise Vault environment is to set up what we call retention categories. These retention categories will give you the capability of setting up a period of time from which, if you run what's called storage expiry, you'll actually be able to automatically delete these items. This can help save on our storage. If we can get rid of stuff that we do not have to have forever automatically, that'll make it very nice for us to maintain our environment. Another thing when we say Enterprise Vault that we're discussing is something called Optimized Single Instant Storage, or OSIS. When we're working with this Optimized Single Instant Storage, the idea is I'm going to figure out a way in which I can identify which items are identical. Once I've identified these particular items as being identical, I will then only store one copy of that item. And we'll also go through and look at how configurable this can be. You have a lot of functionality in determining where you're going to be doing single instance storage and setting up what's called sharing levels to define this single instance storage environment. Next thing that comes up periodically is the idea of, is archiving and backing up the same thing? Well, let's look at what backup does for us. One of the reasons why we typically do a backup is for disaster recovery. We're worried about an Exchange server crashing, a file server crashing, and us being able to restore those items. So we can go through and do periodic backups, nightly, weekly, whatever your schedule happens to be, and then when that particular environment crashes, we can then recover that particular environment. However, there is a shortfall with this. It's typically a short-lived copy because we're constantly changing the data on the Exchange server. We're getting new mail, we're sending mail, our file servers are getting files, we're deleting files. So for all these different reasons, it just ends up not being very functional for long-term storage. So that takes us to the next reason we back up, which is going to be backing items up for archival purposes. This gives us a longer life cycle on the backup, but the problem is that if I'm using it for archiving, people are periodically going to want to see those files. Well, in a lot of backup software, it doesn't come with a search capability other than being able to search for a particular backup. Being able to search for files, being able to search for actual content within the file is very hard. As well as the fact that typically when you're going to be retrieving from these backups, it's going to take an administrative intervention. The end user just can't do it themselves. So Enterprise Vault is going to help us with this. It's going to give us the capability of indexing all the information that we place into our archives, which is going to allow our users to be able to search, find what they need to be able to find, and be able to retrieve it themselves. Also, we're going to go up and set this retention concept. Again, those backup archiving, we might have files out there and backup tapes in the last 20 or 30 years, however long you've been backing things up. However, I don't need to retain that. Every time that I retain a particular item on electronic, I'm making myself susceptible to having that discovered in an electronic discovery case for a legal case, and then it can come back and haunt me later. So being able to automatically have those items removed from my system is really a good thing. So that, again, is just to try to straighten out, again, our concepts that there are differences between backing up and archiving your environment. So let's look at some of the benefits that Enterprise Vault as an archiving tool brings to us. It gives you the capability of centralizing the management and retention of all your information, whether it's email, whether it's PST files. If you're in a Domino environment, Enterprise Vault supports Domino, and in NSF problems. It's also going to help us with our backup issues because the archive data that people do not access routinely is fairly static. We won't have to back that up as often. The stuff that people are accessing routinely, we will have moved or keep up on the frontline storage environment, and they will have to back that up more often, but it's going to be a much smaller piece of our overall storage environment. Also, we can archive more than email. Again, this particular course mainly addresses the Exchange environment and archiving email, but we can also archive SharePoint, instant messaging, file servers. We have all that capability, which is going to hopefully give you the capability to be able to consolidate your servers, reduce the overall amount of that frontline storage that you have to have, and give you the capability of moving that information off to lower cost secondary or even tertiary storage. Also, as we mentioned, it's going to give us the capability of searching and finding this information. This is going to be great when you have to do electronic discovery. Electronic discovery is typically going to be required if you have a particular compliance regulation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later here in the lesson, exactly what we mean by compliance regulations. But it could be a company policy that says that you have to retain items for a certain period of time, or again, it could be a court case. You're being sued, or you need to go through and verify that something hasn't been deleted prior to the time that it needs to be deleted for. So this electronic discovery capability, searching the indexes, is something else that Enterprise Vault is going to provide you with a great benefit of. So let's go through and look at the different functions that we were talking about, a little bit more detail for the benefits that Enterprise Vault brings to the table. So the first thing we want to look at is what is Enterprise Vault doing and trying to relate this to an environment that you may have in your particular company. You start off with the user workstation. We have the three little circles there with the boxes in them to represent files on that user's workstation. We also have little envelopes to represent the email that starts off on that user's workstation. But it doesn't stay on that user's workstation. That particular file may end up on a SharePoint server. It may end up on a file server. The mail is going to end up on your email environment, which again, in this course, we're going to be concentrating on Exchange as your email server. So what are we going to bring to the table when we bring in Enterprise Vault? Well, Enterprise Vault can take those files, can take those emails, store them in the Enterprise Vault environment. It does it in a secure way. You can use your access control list that you had on the original files, can stay with the particular files or emails when they move to Enterprise Vault. We're going to rationalize that data, which means we're going to compress it to try to get a storage savings out of it. We're also going to go through and deduplicate that. Now, when we use the term deduplicate, we're talking about that ability of recognizing particular items as being identical. And instead of storing that particular item multiple times, we're going to store it once. This is also part of what we call single instance storage. So single instance storage and deduplication go hand in hand. We're also going to give you that capability of retaining it for the period of time that you need to retain it. If you no longer need to have it, you can expire it and have it automatically removed from your environment. We're also going to set you up for future proofing. The idea here is that our indexes are either going to be a basic text file or it's going to be hypertext markup language, HTML. Well, these are typically readable in any text editor or any browser type of an application. So it doesn't matter if you don't have the original application that created that file or that email, you should still be able to open it up in the future, either using a web browser or a basic text editor. As we mentioned, we're going to index this items to give you the capability of searching and retrieving those items once you found them. We're also going to give you the capability of doing classification and categorization. This can be very useful in helping you do searches. Instead of searching for thousands of emails, maybe I can just search for the ones that have been categorized financial. So therefore, I don't have to worry about personal emails that were put away. If it got categorized financial, I can limit my search to that. And we'll see that we have different tools that can do that categorization for us, one of them being the data classification service. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more detail later. But once you've got it on the server, it's not just about having it on the server and optimizing these frontline servers by taking that information off of them, but we also have got to give users access to that information. We've got to give it transparent, so as far as the end user is concerned, that file exists where it's always existed. They don't even know that it's been moved off to Enterprise Vault. They can search it, and again, we can do that discovery, and we have the capability of being able to apply permissions on who can see what in those archives. So all of this ultimately ends up for your Enterprise Vault providing you with less expensive storage options for that older information, faster performance on the frontline applications and for backups, and more reliability by reducing the load on your frontline servers. Speaking of which, let's kind of break this down a little bit. We're going to go through and look at some what we call archive behaviors. In a client type situation, we want to be able to user initiate email archiving. But also, we may not want to wait for the individual users to do that archiving. There's a need to have the mail moved off those Exchange servers. So we also want to be able to set up and have automatic mail archiving as well. But we may not want to archive everything. So we want to be able to set up predefined rules that are going to define exactly what gets archived, when it gets archived, and when that particular item can be removed from your environment. As we mentioned earlier, and we will continue to talk about, I'm going to convert all the text that is convertible. Now again, that means it has to be in a format that supports being converted. If I'm looking at picture files, JPEG, TIFF, those cannot be indexed. They will not be converted. However, most emails, most documents, most spreadsheets, all that has the capability of being converted to HTML and or text, as well as being compressed to provide you with that capability of gaining additional storage space. And don't forget about the deduplication and single instance storage. If I recognize those files are identical, I don't have to have those multiple copies on my storage system. And as we mentioned before, as part of that conversion, we're going to be doing indexing of whatever we can convert, and we'll be able to save those indexes to allow for searching and retrieval of those items based upon those searches. Converting that into an option that's available inside of Enterprise Vault for archiving, we're going to give you the option of replacing an item with a shortcut. This will be both for Exchange and Domino. Again, this course concentrates on the Exchange solution. We have a separate course for those of you who may be using Domino as well. You don't have to use a shortcut. You have the option of, with Virtual Vault, having it look exactly like a mail item in your Outlook environment. You can go through and replace a file server with items, or items on the file server, with a placeholder. Once again, that's going to take up a lot less space than the original file. We can delete the original item, and you can control when that deletion is going to occur, doing something which is called remove safety copies, and we'll talk about different settings that will be available for that. You can also do it immediately, or you can do it after a backup if you want to have that one more copy just to be safe type of an environment. And we will give you the capability or option of setting up both monitoring to see how your system's doing, is it doing what you expect it to do, and also the capability of reporting, both on that monitoring capability as well as being able to keep track of how the actual archiving usage is happening, which users are using up what space, things like that. As we mentioned, one of the advantages that the Enterprise Vault is bringing is this efficient use of storage. So in this example, we're just doing a little animation to try to help reinforce that concept. We're starting off with 3 of the typical frontline servers, which are email, SharePoint, and file server. And again, as we move into the later lessons, we're going to kind of leave file servers and SharePoint behind and concentrate on that Exchange and email environment. But in this example, we're just showing you we have files with the little circles with the boxes on them, representing either email on email server or shared items on SharePoint or physical files on your file server. when we introduce our Enterprise Vault environment, we're going to remove those items from those frontline servers. Now again, you will have the capability of determining when that occurs, that removal, which is called removing those safety copies. Now once we get it on the Enterprise Vault server, one of the advantages that it's bringing to the table, as we mentioned, is I can try to identify this particular item and to see if it is a duplicate. If it is a duplicate, why store it 3 times? I can just convert it from 3 individual files into a single file. Everybody that needs access to that file, I'll just set up a reference to where that one copy lives. Everybody still has access to it, but it's stored once. And not only that, but I can take it off the Enterprise Vault storage mechanisms and even move it off onto a third or tertiary storage mechanism. And these secondary and tertiary storage mechanisms, as the slide shows you, could be an NT file system, NTFS, could be a NetApp device, could be an EMC, Centera, or Solera type of environments, IBM devices, storage tech. We will see in later lessons a list of the different types of storage devices that are available. It also supports itself to, or lends itself to working with devices that do single instance storage themselves, which have deduplication and compression built in, as well as worm devices. Another thing that we said that Enterprise Vault was bringing as a feature was storage reduction through eliminating PST files everywhere. So in this particular animation, we're starting off showing you that you're going to have PST files either on the client or on the server, based upon whether you have it set up locally or if you have it set up on a share on the file server someplace. Now again, you typically back up your PC. You're going to back up your servers in your network environment. So now I've got copies of those PST files on my servers and my PC backups as well. So you can see these PST files just seem to be multiplying. So what would I like to do with Enterprise Vault? Well, one of the things that I need to do is locate those PST files. So I have mechanisms that will go out and search for those files, and we'll have a lesson on this separately, PST migration, that will show you the different ways we have of locating these files both on PCs as well as on the individual file servers. Now, not only though do I want to locate these files where they're located, I want to move them off those devices. Get those PSTs into an archive. Now that they're in an archive, once I've migrated them over, all the users will have access to their PST files. I don't have all those copies everywhere. I can manage them again from that centralized location. Also, again, as we mentioned before, that deduplication, that single instance storage is going to be available. But we can't forget the idea of once I've migrated these PSTs into the Enterprise Vault environment, that I may want to expire them, determine a retention period, get rid of them after a period of time. But also the end user still needs to be able to have access to those PST files. Because as far as they're concerned, those PST files still might be locally, or they still might actually be on that network share. Another functionality that the Enterprise Vault environment is going to bring is that journal archiving. In an Exchange environment, Domino also, but again we're concentrating on Exchange here, in an Exchange environment you have the capability of setting up your Exchange server to perform journaling. There's different types of journaling that you can set up based upon the version of Exchange. But ultimately, whatever type of journaling you do in your Exchange environment, it's going to end up in a journal mailbox. Well, again, a journal mailbox is a mailbox. If we can archive users' mailboxes, why don't we archive those journal mailboxes? And what's really nice about these journal mailboxes is that they are going to contain items from every item that's either gone into or out of that particular Exchange server. This is going to give us the advantage of being able to be compliant with whether government regulations or our own company policies to prevent being fined. Also, as we mentioned, that gives you the capability that there are legal environments out there. You got a case against you, or just your lawyers want to verify that you are, in fact, not violating any compliance regulations. You can do what's called e-discovery, which is short for electronic discovery. And with this electronic discovery, it's really nice that when we put the particular items into the archive, we can classify them. And we can classify them with something called the data classification services. If you have worked with Enterprise Vault in the past, we had something called the Automatic Classification Engine, or ACE. The data classification services are the newer version designed to replace that automatic classification engine. It gives you much more functionality and much more flexibility. As we mentioned, the indexing, the idea is it makes the archive searchable. Again, if I just archived it and didn't actually index that content, I wouldn't be able to search that information. Now, what is actually indexed? We'll be talking about that a little bit later in another lesson. How much of that material indexed is based upon what you want to do, what you want to be able to search, as well as the storage that's going to be necessary for that. We're going to scan all the messages, convert it into HTML or text. That was part of what we called future proofing, but also in that process of converting it into either HTML or text, we're going to be indexing that information and storing it in a separate location to make it searchable. This will give you that capability, again, of doing electronic discovery as well as that retrieval. When I search for something and find it, I can tell the storage service to return that item. It also is going to be a very powerful search engine, very fast. In Enterprise Vault 10, we're introducing that 64-bit search engine, that 64-bit indexing engine. We're going to go through in a later lesson and look at exactly what that brings to the table. The user access, we said again, even though we've archived the items, the user still needs to be able to have access to them and see them. So in our first little screenshot here, we're showing you a screenshot from Outlook. So typically in an Enterprise Vault environment, or at least one choice in your Enterprise Vault environment, is to set up shortcuts. So periodically when an item is archived, whether it's automatically through Enterprise Vault, or if you give the user permission to manually enable that particular item, you can go through and archive it and have it replaced with a shortcut. Now again, this is an option. You won't always see shortcuts. But if your administrators have set this up, this is what you would see. So you basically just blew up that shortcut icon to show you that you still have access to those items that are physically stored in what's called a Vault Store partition. And we'll be coming back to that terminology in this lesson when we get into the architecture. Now, another view that we can show you, again, this is just to show you we have multiple ways of accessing this information, is through something called Archive Explorer. Once again, if you have permission to use the Archive Explorer, you can basically see a hierarchical view of all the items that have been stored in your archive. This Archive Explorer uses a web interface. So we'll see that Enterprise Vault provides this web application type of an interface for some of its search applications. Outlook Web Access, browser search, in this case here, the Archive Explorer. So we'll go through and look at how each of those work when we get into those client lessons later on. As I mentioned before, we do have some additional components that can be added on to the Enterprise Vault environment. One of these is called Compliance Accelerator. The idea of Compliance Accelerator is it sets up an automatic capture mechanism and a review process to help you monitor your mail system. Now, compliance is only for email, all right? So it's going to ensure that you are compliant either with an industry regulation. For example, in the United States, we have a regulation called Sarbanes-Oxley, or SOX. But again, a lot of people think that compliance is only for the United States. But we're seeing more and more other countries have compliance regulations. For example, in the UK, they have a regulation called the Combined Code, which was issued by the London Stock Exchange. This is basically their version of our Sarbanes-Oxley regulation. In Australia, we have the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, or APRA, that's responsible for setting up regulations that are associated with Australian actions in the financial world. In Japan, it's the Financial Instruments and Exchange Law. In Canada, it's Bill 198. So again, I just want to give you some examples that compliance isn't just for the United States anymore. We're seeing more and more countries have these regulations. But it's not just about the countries regulating us. We also have policies within our own company. Uses of email. Are people using it for personal use? Are they using it for business use? Are people sending emails to places they shouldn't? All this can be checked with these Compliance Accelerator tool. The other tool that we have is the Discovery Accelerator. Again, we kept mentioning this concept of electronic discovery, or e-discovery. Discovery Accelerator gives you a great way of organizing the information that's going to be searched. Those indexes that we search with Discovery Accelerator, we can set all this up inside of cases and then analyze and be able to store that information until the case is done. We can actually set up what's called a legal hold. We'll be showing you in a later lesson how you can set up effectively a legal hold if you don't have Discovery Accelerator. The Discovery Accelerator does so much more. And not only can it find and organize this information for you, but it can actually publish it in a format that can be used as evidence in court cases. It also gives you the ability of interacting with other legal software, so that you'll be able to do that as well. Now, moving on past what the functions and what Enterprise Vault is going to do for us, let's start looking at the basic architecture, and we'll discuss what we call logical containers as well as physical containers for storing our items in Enterprise Vault. Starting off, Enterprise Vault is typically going to run on a Windows server. It is also required, because of web interface type of functionality on that server, to have the Internet Information Services installed, or IIS. Also, Enterprise Vault is going to be associated with a SQL server. We're going to use Microsoft SQL Server to provide this functionality. And again, from the best practices standpoint, you typically will want to have your SQL server on a standalone Windows server as well. So in the center there, we've got an example of our Enterprise Vault server running IIS, as well as our SQL server on a separate server. Now, associated with the SQL server is going to be certain physical items. These are going to include the databases, which are going to have the actual data about what is being archived, as well as transaction logs associated with the transactions that take place to put that information in the data. We're also going to go through and associate it with the Enterprise Vault. There's going to be physical storage. This is going to include the indexes as well as the data themselves, or the archives, which are stored in what we call Vault Store partitions. Now, the next piece of the puzzle, as we mentioned before, is what are we trying to archive? Well, we're going to call these frontline servers. There's a variety of different frontline servers that we support archiving for, including file servers, SharePoint servers, Exchange servers. But again, this course is going to concentrate on the Exchange server environment. We need to have some mechanism to manage this. The mechanism that we're going to use to manage this environment is called the Enterprise Vault Administration Console. This Enterprise Vault Administration Console is just a Microsoft Management Console snap-in, so we'll see that it has all the same functionality that a typical Microsoft Management Console has. You can add additional snap-ins and add it and save it. You also have the capability of adding it to a Microsoft Management Console that you may already have saved somewhere else. And then, of course, we need to let that client access take place as well. So the client needs to be able to access both the live data that's on the frontline servers as well as the data we have archived in your Enterprise Vault environment. So let's go and look at this architecture in a little bit more detail. First, we're going to look at where are the items located before we actually archive them. From a terminology standpoint, we're going to call these our targets. These targets are going to identify those front-end servers that we wish to archive with our Enterprise Vault environment. Exchange. There's different types of things that we can set up as a target on the Exchange servers. This includes both user and journal mailboxes, which we've already mentioned, and if you're still using public folders, we can archive your public folder environment as well. If you are using Domino, we can do both the mail and journal on the Domino servers. And in your file server environments, we can set it up so that it can archive it at the server level and volumes and folder levels. And within your SharePoint environment, we've got the capability of setting it up to archive at both the site and site collections environments. So how are these items handled? Or what determines when something is going to be archived? What we're going to do is we're going to take these targets, which we've defined in the Enterprise Vault Administration Console, and then we're going to assign policies to them. We have a variety of different types of policies. We have mailbox policies, desktop policies, file server policies, SharePoint policies, but all these things are going to set up and determine how the items are selected for archiving, if we're going to replace them with shortcuts in the case of email, with placeholders in the case of file servers environments, and when these particular items may be expired or deleted automatically. So these policies are setting all of that up. How are we going to determine what the archiving applies to? Well, we're going to create something called a provisioning group. This provisioning group is going to be a collection of people who are going to be archived, and we can choose different ways of defining these people. We can either use an already predefined Windows security group or distribution group. We can go in and define individual users in the Enterprise Vault, in the Exchange environment. We can set it up for your organizational units that you defined in Active Directory. We can set it up using a lightweight directory access protocol or LDAP query. And then, of course, we can be as generic as just saying that everybody in the Exchange organization has the same group of policies. Now, once we've defined you either as broad, using the whole Exchange server organization, or as narrow as you need, I could set up a separate policy for every user in your organization if you wanted to do it that way. You then need to run a provisioning task. We'll be talking about that in just a moment. And that provisioning task assigns the members to the correct provisioning groups and then assigns the policies that are defined in the or associated with the actual provisioning groups. So what is actually archiving the items? What's archiving the items are called tasks. And these tasks are a variety of different tasks based upon what we're trying to archive. So in our Exchange mailboxes, that's going to be called a mailbox archiving task. For our Exchange journal mailbox, we're going to call that a journaling task, and so on for public folders, SharePoint. And then for the provisioning task, that's going to be based upon one domain. And that one provisioning task for that one domain will, again, assign the users to the groups and the policies to the individual users that are assigned to the groups. And again, you'll see that in more detail when we get into the lesson that discusses provisioning. Also, you can go through and specify for the PST that we give you the example for, the archiving tasks that are going to both locate and migrate that particular item or individual tasks. Now, the big picture, what's controlling all these tasks and when they occur, is called the Task Controller Service. So I have a basic Windows service that's going to be responsible for monitoring and making sure that these tasks are taking place when they're supposed to occur. Where are the items actually stored? The items are stored in archives or vaults. Now, typically, most administrators and users of Enterprise Vault use the term archive and vault interchangeably. There is a very subtle difference between the two. At this particular level, as a basic administrator's course, that difference isn't important. So here we're going to use archive and vault interchangeably. The archives are located in an appropriate container. And these containers are going to be vault store groups, vault stores, which are logical containers, as well as a physical container called a vault store partition. And these containers can contain, again, the Exchange mailbox, journal, public folder, your Domino, either mailbox or journal folders, SharePoint, and file system. There is a special type of archive, though, that's called a shared archive. The shared archive is based upon the necessity in some environments of having multiple users instead of having their individual archives and then setting up permissions so they can see different individual archives, having a location where we can all go. For example, maybe my software development group has business software or business emails that they need to archive, and it makes more sense in my environment to set up one shared archive for all that mail instead of setting up the 100 different software developers I have individual archives. So I have that capability called a shared archive. Now what's really nice when I create these archives, which are represented as folders in our Vault, or Enterprise Vault Administration Console, we can actually take the permissions of the original items through the access control list and pass that access control list right into the Enterprise Vault environment as well. And we'll be looking at that in more detail when we get into the actual processing of the mailbox archiving process. So how do we organize the items? We have all these different items that are being stored. Well, our highest level container is called a Vault Store Group. The Vault Store Group is a container for the individual Vault stores. A Vault Store Group can contain one or more Vault stores. This is what we call the single instance storage boundary. And why we call it this is that when we're setting up the single instance storage, you have the capability of sharing all the items within a single Vault Store Group. If I have an environment that has multiple Vault Store Groups, you cannot share between two different Vault Store Groups. So that's why we call it the boundary. And again, when we get into a little bit more detail and showing you the basic concepts of fingerprinting and this concept of single instance storage in more detail, you'll be able to see that more visually. We have some animations to show you that. It is associated with a database. This database is called the fingerprint database. and there will be one fingerprint database per Vault Store group. You must create a Vault Store group prior to creating any Vault Store. So the next level of storage is the Vault Store then. The Vault Store also has a SQL database associated with it called the Vault Store database. This is created to hold the metadata associated with the items that are being stored in this particular Vault Store. The Vault Store is going to logically organize the Vault Store partitions, which are the physical storage of the actual items. So let's look at the Vault Store partitions. As we mentioned before, these Vault Store partitions are the physical storage locations and the physical devices where we're actually storing the indexes and the archives and the vaults. They can be created on a variety of different types of devices. You can look at the Enterprise Vault Administrative Console Help System to see a listing of those devices, and in a later lesson we'll actually show you a list of some of the different devices that can be used for these Vault Store partitions. We're also going to find out that these partitions have what's called a state, and we'll be looking at that in a little bit more detail later, but these states can either be open, closed, or ready. Those are the three states of a Vault Store partition. And when we talk about the states, a Vault Store partition, you can only have one open in a given Vault Store. So again, that's just some rules to kind of keep in mind. We will be revisiting and reinforcing those particular items. And another thing is that a particular archive itself can span multiple partitions. So it's not like a one-to-one relationship between an archive and a partition. I can have an archive across multiple partitions, and we'll have a graphic later that helps show you that particular situation. Next we want to look at is the concept of how long we store items. Every item in an Enterprise Vault environment has to be assigned a retention category. This retention category is going to determine after a defined starting point, and that defined starting point can either be based upon the modification date of the item or the archive date of the item. Now the tricky thing about this is archive date is pretty straightforward. It's when you actually have the item placed into the Enterprise Vault archive. However, the modified date is different for email and file systems. So we'll come back and talk about that in a little bit more detail later, what a modified date is. Now just because we have assigned a retention category, which is how long we want to retain this item for, doesn't mean it automatically gets deleted. In order for it to automatically get deleted, you have to also turn on something called storage expiry. And we'll be looking at how to set that up and configure that in later lessons. So to have that automatic deletion functionality, you have to have both a retention category and you have to turn on expiry. But again, every item in Enterprise Vault will be assigned a particular retention category. How do we access the particular items? We're going to see that we have a variety of ways of seeing the items that have been archived. For our client, we typically have what's called the client extensions. We have the Outlook client, which uses the Enterprise Vault add-in. We also support an Entourage client, as well as giving you Outlook web access. We can also give you a web-based type of access through active server pages. These are running on the Internet Information Server, IIS server, which is typically running on your Enterprise Vault server, and it's going to give you access through our integrated search, our browser search, Archive Explorer, as well as that mobile device search, which is the mobile client. And again, we'll be looking at those in more detail when we get into the lessons that are associated with client access. What enables the items to be searchable? That's the indexes again. We've mentioned that several times, and we're going to keep reinforcing that item throughout the course. All searches use the index content for that particular archive. The items that are indexed when they are stored. And again, we're going to have a little animation later on that's going to show you that process. When a storage service is using or going through the process of retrieving the item and placing it into storage, it's actually going to, as part of that, notify the indexing service so that we can create that either HTML and or text version of the document and have it indexed. When you're setting it up, we have different types of indexing levels. I mentioned this before. I'm going to give you the names of those two different indexing levels, and we'll discuss them a little bit more in a little bit more detail later. The names are brief and full, so those are our two indexing levels in the Enterprise Vault 10 environment. Each archive will have one index. Each index can have one or more index volumes. Now, when we just say that, it is a little bit confusing. However, we'll have some diagrams later. We have a separate indexing chapter where we'll go into that architecture and give you some graphics to help make that make a little bit more sense. So when we go through and set that up, we'll be able to see what we're talking about when we say that an archive has an index and an index has one or more index volumes. There's a separate index for each one of the archives, and each index consists of a set of related files. So we'll store it in a folder hierarchy type of a environment, and we'll be looking at that in the indexing lesson. And for most of the archives, there's just going to be one folder or index volume for the index files. But again, it has to do with the number of items that are being archived will determine that indexing size. The administrators are going to configure the location where the indexes are actually stored, and they configure the indexing level. As our first introduction, though, this is something that you definitely want to plan for up front, because when you go through and if you change it later, you will have to re-index to change from brief to full. So when you're setting everything up, make sure you decide which one you want to use. And again, later we'll be explaining the differences between the brief indexing and the full indexing. What controls all the processes? We have Enterprise Vault services. These are just regular Windows services. You can open up your management console, go into the Windows services, and you'll see these services listed. The Enterprise Vault administration service, indexing, shopping service, they'll all be listed there. They're installed on the Enterprise Vault server. They don't have to be on every Enterprise Vault server. When we get into the lesson that deals with scaling your Enterprise Vault server, as well as the lesson on indexing, we'll talk about why you might want to have certain services running on certain Enterprise Vault servers. But you give the capability of being able to set up these different services. The storage service is responsible for managing the Enterprise Vault storage of the archive data. We've mentioned indexing, so the indexing service is responsible for providing those requests for indexing and actually performing the indexing. The shopping service is based for your web-based type of search features to give you the capability of restoring multiple items at a single time. And as we mentioned earlier, the task controller service is actually responsible for running all the individual tasks, such as the mailbox archiving task or the journaling task. Next, we keep using some terms when we talk about Enterprise Vault. These are directory and site. So let's define what an Enterprise Vault directory and site are. Starting off with the Enterprise Vault directory, you must have an Enterprise Vault directory in order for you to have an Enterprise Vault environment. This is central to your organization of Enterprise Vault. There will be a database created as part of the data directory creation. That SQL Server database will be accessed by the directory service, which is one of the services we hadn't listed on the previous slide, but we'll discuss here in a moment. When you create that Enterprise Vault directory database, it'll be created on the SQL Server. Typically, it'll be the same SQL Server where you have the Vault Store database and the Fingerprint database, which was a couple databases we mentioned earlier. This is going to store all the configuration information that is associated with the Enterprise Vault sites. So what are the Enterprise Vault sites? This is a logical container which represents a group of Enterprise Vault servers that share the same components and configuration settings. That's a big thing right there. If you need to have different site configuration settings, you may need to set up your Enterprise Vault for a multiple site configuration. Even if you have multiple Enterprise Vault sites, you can still have a single directory. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail later in a later lesson. It's independent of physical sites. That's another thing we have to make sure we point out. Those of you that deal with Exchange have probably dealt with Active Directory, and we know that an Active Directory site has to do with network connectivity. It has to do with the fact of having high-speed connections between your servers. When we use an Enterprise Vault site, again, it's the same type of an environment. It is a logical grouping, not a physical location of those particular devices. And again, we can set up certain settings that can apply to all the components that exist in that particular Enterprise Vault site. And we'll see that in more detail as we get into how we've organized the Enterprise Vault Administration Console for administering our Enterprise Vault environment. As we mentioned, what's actually controlling the Enterprise Vault is the Enterprise Vault Administration Service. The Enterprise Vault Admin Service is responsible for monitoring all those other services, the shopping, the indexing, the storage, those types of services. It's going to be used by the Enterprise Vault environment to monitor those services. If there is some kind of a problem in your Enterprise Vault environment, The Enterprise Vault Administration Service is responsible for trying to shut down the other services to minimize the data loss if something catastrophic does in fact happen. The other main service is that Enterprise Vault Directory Service. This allows all the other services to communicate with that directory database. So it's that interface between the Enterprise Vault environment and that directory database. It's going to run on computers where the Enterprise Vault is installed. It runs on all the Enterprise Vault servers. It's responsible for monitoring the data that the mail-in servers are archiving. It keeps track of which users' data is being processed, which users have access to that particular data. And as I mentioned earlier, it also keeps track of all the other services and provides them access to the directory information when they need access to the Enterprise Vault directory data and the data that's stored in that database. So as we mentioned, you're going to manage your Enterprise Vault environment through the Enterprise Vault Administration Console. This is our first view of looking at the Enterprise Vault Administration Console. Again, it's just a Microsoft Management snap-in. So if you worked with any other Microsoft Management Console snap-in, it has the same type of an environment. On the left-hand side of the window, you have a tree view of the objects, and you can start to see some of the things that we were defining earlier. Up towards the top, we have Enterprise Vault, which is our application. Then we move down to the directory that's running on EV Server. A little further down, we start looking at the sites. Again, you can have more than one site on a directory. So that's why EV Site 1 shows up under the directory on EV Server. And then we have the different components that we talked about or defined a little bit earlier, such as the targets, the policies, the Enterprise Vault servers, our archives, our Vault stored groups. We also have a new thing in the Enterprise Vault Administration Console, which is the indexing node. The indexing node is there because we've introduced index server groups, and that's going to be important to that, and we'll get into that in more detail in our indexing lesson. And then we also have our personal store management, which is for the PST management, that locate, migrate, and collect type of a management system. And then the bottom thing we have there on the bottom is the Enterprise Vault Online, which gives you some references for help, and we'll be looking at that a little bit later. So now we just wanted to kind of give you a big picture of all the different pieces that are going to come together to make up your Enterprise Vault environment. So as we started off in the bottom, or in the middle there, we have the Enterprise Vault services and tasks that are going to be running on our Enterprise Vault server. Those services and tasks, and if we have multiple Enterprise Vault servers, are all going to belong together in an Enterprise Vault site. That Enterprise Vault site is going to belong to an Enterprise Vault directory. That Enterprise Vault server is going to need to access indexes for searching and retrieval purposes. Also, it's going to have access to a SQL server. That SQL server is going to maintain and keep access to our databases and our transaction logs for us. Our Enterprise Vault server is also going to have databases associated with the Vault stored groups, which is called the fingerprint database, and the Vault store database, which is just the Vault store database. Also, we have to access that directory database. So we have several databases we'll be working with. We also have an additional database for monitoring, which is called the Enterprise Vault Operations Management Database. We'll look at that in a later lesson. And then we talk about what's actually being archived, those target servers that are actually going to be archived by Enterprise Vault. Users need to be able to access the live data that's still on those target servers, as well as the things that we've archived. And then we can't forget the administrative tool that we're going to be using mostly for setting up and administering our Enterprise Vault environment, which is that Enterprise Vault Administration Console. So in this lesson, we looked at the Enterprise Vault as a modular system that's responsible for archiving our unstructured data from either messaging, file, SharePoint, and other types of servers. We also learned that Enterprise Vault enables compliance with rules and regulations, as well as automatic management and deletion of data that's no longer required if configured. In addition, we looked at the basic physical and logical structure of how we're going to manage our Enterprise Vault deployment. For our reference materials, we have the Enterprise Vault CD or the installation media that you've been supplied with. You also want to look at the Symantec Vault Enterprise Introduction and Planning Guide. It has a lot of the information that we discussed in this particular course, as well as we have a reference to a compatibility guide on the slide as well. And this brings us to the end of Lesson 1.